Li Si is one of the most underestimated and influential figures in all of Chinese history. Most people, if they know his name at all, only think of him as Qin Shi Huang's chief advisor. But the more I research his life and work, the more I realize we're talking about the true intellectual architect of imperial China. This guy didn't just help create the first unified Chinese empire. He literally invented many of the institutions and policies that would define Chinese civilization for the next 2 millennia. Li Si was born around 280 BCE in the state of Chu, in what's now Hunan province. His family wasn't aristocratic, basically middle-class merchants. But what's fascinating is how his humble background apparently motivated him to seek power and influence through intellectual merit rather than inherited connections. There's this famous story about how when he was young, he was working as a minor clerk in a granary and he saw rats eating stored grain. He noticed that the rats in the granary were fat and prosperous, while the rats in the latrines were skinny and miserable, and this supposedly inspired him to realize that success in life depended primarily on positioning yourself in the right circumstances. This anecdote, if it's true, really captures something essential about Li Si's mentality. He wasn't a romantic idealist who believed in noble abstract principles. He was fundamentally a pragmatist who understood that political power was about finding the right levers and being willing to use them ruthlessly when necessary. This practical perspective would lead him to both great achievements and spectacular downfall. What really changed the trajectory of his life was when he decided to study with Xunzi, who was one of the most important Confucian philosophers, but also one of the most pessimistic and realistic. While many Confucians believed that human beings were basically good and just needed proper education and role models, Xunzi argued that human nature was inherently selfish and that civilized society was only possible through strong institutions and strict governmental control. This philosophical education gave Li Si the intellectual framework that he would later use to help design the Qin state. But here's what's fascinating. Li Si didn't stay within the Confucian tradition. While studying with Xunzi, he was also heavily influenced by legalist ideas, particularly the work of Han Fei, who had been a fellow student. Legalism was basically the most radical and authoritarian philosophical school in ancient China, arguing that society should be controlled through uniform strict laws, mass surveillance, and severe punishments for any deviation. Legalists believed that effective rulers shouldn't rely on personal virtue or social consensus, but on institutions that made compliance automatic and inevitable. Around 247 BCE, when Li Si was about 33 years old, he made the crucial decision to leave his home state of Chu and travel to Qin to seek political opportunities. This was an enormously risky decision because Qin had a reputation for being brutal and authoritarian, and many intellectuals from other states viewed it as a barbarous and dangerous place. But Li Si apparently realized that Qin was also the most dynamic and successful state, and that it offered the best opportunities for someone with his talents and ambitions. Initially, he had trouble gaining access to the Qin court, but he eventually managed to catch the attention of Lu Bue, who was the prime minister and possibly the biological father of the future Qin Shi Huang. Li Si apparently impressed Lu Bue with his intelligence and knowledge of legalist philosophy, and he began rising through the administrative hierarchy. But what really launched his career was when the young king, Ying Zheng, began asserting independent authority and looking for advisors who could help him implement his ambitious visions of conquest and unification. Li Si's first major contribution to Qin policy was helping develop the strategy they would use to systematically conquer the other warring states. This wasn't just military planning, but a sophisticated approach that combined warfare, diplomacy, espionage, and economic warfare. Li Si understood that military victory alone wouldn't be sufficient to create a stable, lasting empire. They also needed to develop political institutions and cultural ideas that could legitimize their rule over diverse populations that had their own traditions and identities. One of his most important innovations was the concept of division of power and unification of authority. Li Si argued that the warring states had failed because they allowed different groups and institutions to compete for influence, creating constant instability and conflict. His solution was to centralize all real political authority in the emperor, while dividing administrative authority among different ministries that would balance each other out. This would prevent any individual official or group of officials from accumulating enough power to challenge imperial authority. During the Unification Wars from 230 to 221 BCE, Li Si wasn't just a theoretical advisor, but an active participant in strategic planning and policy implementation. He developed many of the espionage and propaganda techniques that Qin used to weaken their enemies from within. He also helped design the policies that Qin would implement in conquered territories to rapidly integrate them into the Qin administrative system and prevent rebellions. But where Li Si really demonstrated his genius was in the period after 221 BCE, when Qin Shi Huang declared himself emperor of the first unified Chinese empire. The challenge they faced was absolutely enormous: how to effectively govern a territory that extended across millions of square miles and included tens of millions of people who spoke different dialects, followed different customs, and had completely different histories of government and cultural identity. Li Si's solution was to implement what was essentially the first program of mass cultural standardization in world history. This included standardizing writing, so that people from different regions could communicate with each other in writing, standardizing currency, so that trade could function smoothly across the empire, standardizing weights and measures, so that commercial transactions could be consistent, and even standardizing the width of cartwheels, so that roads built in one region could be used by vehicles from any other region. But the most controversial and far-reaching standardization was cultural and intellectual. Li Si was the principal architect of the policy known as burning of books and burying of scholars. In 213 BCE, he convinced Qin Shi Huang to order the destruction of most philosophical and historical texts, particularly those that promoted alternative ideas about government and social organization. His argument was that as long as people could appeal to alternative intellectual traditions, there would always be grounds for challenging imperial authority and promoting political fragmentation. From a modern perspective, this looks like horrible totalitarian censorship, and in many ways that's exactly what it was. But Li Si was operating from the legalist premise that social stability requires intellectual consensus about basic principles, and that allowing open debate about fundamental political questions would inevitably lead to chaos and conflict. His goal wasn't to suppress knowledge in general, but to eliminate specific types of knowledge that could be used to challenge the legitimacy of the imperial system. The administrative standardization program that Li Si developed was equally radical. He completely abolished the feudal system that had dominated China for centuries, where territory was controlled by hereditary lords who had semi-independent authority over their domains. Instead, he created a system where the entire empire was divided into commanderies and counties, administered by appointed officials who served at the emperor's pleasure and could be removed or transferred at any time. This wasn't just a technical, administrative reform. It was a fundamental change in the entire structure of political and social power. Under the old feudal system, loyalty was personal and hereditary. People served specific lords because their families had been connected for generations. But under Li Si's system, all loyalty was supposed to run directly to the emperor and the imperial state. It was the first attempt to create what we would now call national citizenship, rather than local or tribal loyalty. To make this system work, Li Si also developed one of the most sophisticated civil service systems in the ancient world. He created examinations and evaluation procedures for selecting officials based on ability and knowledge rather than family connections. He established clear bureaucratic hierarchies with specific job descriptions and procedures for promotion. He even developed rotation systems that would prevent officials from developing local power bases that might compete with central authority. But Li Si wasn't just an administrative theorist. He was also a master practical politician who understood the importance of symbolism, ceremony, and what we'd now call public relations. He helped design the elaborate court ceremonies that emphasized the almost divine authority of the emperor. He oversaw the construction of massive monuments and public works projects that demonstrated imperial power. He even developed new styles of calligraphic writing that would be used exclusively for imperial documents, creating a distinct visual identity for the central government. One of Li Si's most ingenious innovations was his approach to information and intelligence management. He understood that effectively governing such a vast empire required constant, accurate information about what was happening in different regions. He created networks of informants and spies who reported directly to the central government. He established rapid communication systems using horse relays that could transmit messages across enormous distances in days rather than weeks. He even developed cryptographic techniques to protect sensitive government communications. But what really fascinates me about Li Si is how he balanced practical considerations with long-term ideological vision. He wasn't simply an efficient bureaucrat who implemented policies that others had designed. He was a systematic thinker who had a coherent theory about how human society should function and who was willing to use whatever means necessary to implement that vision. His political theory was based on the premise that human beings are fundamentally selfish and that social cooperation is only possible when people are subject to powerful external incentives. He believed that effective governments need to be able to reward compliance and punish deviation quickly, consistently, and inevitably. He argued that mercy and flexibility in law enforcement were actually cruel because they created uncertainty and encouraged people to gamble that they might get away with breaking rules. This philosophy led him to implement what was probably the most severe and comprehensive legal system in the ancient world. Qin laws covered virtually every aspect of social and economic life, from commercial regulations to personal behavior. The penalties for violations were extraordinarily harsh. Even relatively minor crimes could result in mutilation, slavery, or death. But Li Si argued that this system actually reduced overall suffering because it made crime so rare that most people would never experience violence or punishment at all. The collective responsibility system that Li Si implemented was particularly innovative and controversial. Under this system, people were organized into small groups, typically 5 families, who were mutually responsible for each member's behavior. If someone in the group committed a crime and wasn't reported by the others, all group members would face punishment. This created massive incentives for social surveillance and reporting of deviance, but it also meant that people had strong reasons to help their neighbors stay within the law. The economic policies that Li Si developed were equally systematic and innovative. He understood that military and political power ultimately depended on economic resources, and that a successful empire needed to maximize agricultural and manufacturing production while carefully controlling trade and distribution. He implemented policies that incentivized farming and discouraged commerce and crafts as secondary occupations, arguing that farmers were more politically reliable than merchants because they were tied to specific locations and couldn't move easily. He also developed one of the first systems of centralized economic planning, where the imperial government would set production quotas for different regions and oversee the distribution of strategic goods. This allowed the government to maintain massive reserves of grain and other supplies that could be used to support the military during campaigns or provide relief during natural disasters. But where Li Si really demonstrated his political genius was in how he managed the transition from conquest to stable government. He understood that simply defeating the other states wouldn't be sufficient. They also needed to integrate conquered populations into the new imperial order in ways that would prevent future rebellions and create genuine legitimacy for Qin rule. His strategy involved a combination of coercion and incentives. On one hand, he implemented extremely harsh policies against any form of resistance or disloyalty. Entire populations were forcibly resettled if they were deemed to represent security risks. Local leaders, who might serve as focal points for resistance, were systematically eliminated or co-opted. On the other hand, he also created genuine opportunities for talented people from conquered regions to advance through the imperial bureaucratic system and gain wealth and status by serving the new regime. One of Li Si's most important innovations was his approach to managing ethnic and cultural diversity within the empire. The states that Qin conquered included groups that had very different languages, customs, religious traditions, and social structures. The traditional approach would have been to allow these groups to maintain their distinctive cultural particularities while paying tribute to imperial power. But Li Si argued that this would create permanent grounds for fragmentation and conflict. Instead, he implemented policies designed to gradually create a unified national culture that would transcend regional and ethnic identities. This involved not just technical standardization of things like writing and currency, but also active promotion of shared values, symbols, and institutions. He established national festivals that would be celebrated uniformly across the empire. He created civic rituals that would reinforce loyalty to the emperor and state. He even developed educational programs that would teach children from different regions the same basic texts and fundamental ideas. The transportation and infrastructure system that Li Si oversaw was absolutely revolutionary and had both economic and political implications. The road network he built wasn't just about facilitating trade and communication. It was also about projecting imperial power and making it possible for the central military to respond quickly to threats anywhere in the empire. The roads were built to standard military specifications, with bridges that could support heavy wagons and relay stations where troops could resupply. But Li Si also understood the importance of infrastructure projects for creating political legitimacy. The construction of roads, irrigation canals, and flood control systems provided tangible benefits to local populations that helped justify heavy taxation and forced labor. People could see that their suffering was contributing to real improvements that would make their lives better in the long run. What really impresses me about Li Si is how systematically he thought about problems that modern governments still face. How to create national unity in diverse societies, how to balance individual freedom with social order, how to make large bureaucracies efficient and responsive, how to manage information in complex political systems. His solutions were often harsh and authoritarian, but they were also remarkably effective at achieving their objectives. The educational system that Li Si developed is particularly fascinating because it foreshadowed many features of modern educational systems. He established government schools that would teach standardized curricula across the empire. He created textbooks that would present official versions of history, philosophy, and practical knowledge. He developed testing systems that would evaluate whether students had mastered required material. He even established institutions of higher education that would train government officials and provide advanced research in fields like agriculture, engineering, and medicine. But this educational system was also designed as a tool of political control. Li Si understood that if the government could control what people learned when they were young, it could shape their values and loyalties for life. The textbooks would emphasize the importance of obedience to the emperor and compliance with law. The examinations would test not just technical knowledge, but also correct political attitudes. The teachers would be government officials who would report any signs of subversive thinking or disloyalty. Li Si's relationship with Qin Shi Huang was complex and fascinating. On one hand, there was clearly genuine mutual respect and intellectual collaboration between them. Li Si provided the theoretical framework and technical expertise that made it possible for Qin Shi Huang to implement his ambitious visions. Qin Shi Huang provided the political authority and force of will necessary to overcome massive resistance to radical changes. But on the other hand, there was also constant tension between them over specific methods and priorities. Li Si was fundamentally a pragmatist who wanted to build stable, lasting institutions. Qin Shi Huang was more impulsive and impatient, often more interested in monumental projects that would demonstrate his personal greatness than in mundane but important administrative reforms. This tension became particularly acute during the later years of Qin Shi Huang's reign, when the emperor became increasingly obsessed with achieving personal immortality. Li Si apparently thought these projects were wastes of resources that could be better spent on strengthening governmental institutions. But he couldn't directly challenge the emperor without risking his own position and possibly his life. The beginning of the end for Li Si came with the death of Qin Shi Huang in 210 BCE. The emperor died while traveling in eastern China, and Li Si faced an immediate crisis about how to handle the power transition. The designated heir, Fusu, was stationed with the army on the northern frontier and had a reputation for being more moderate and less authoritarian than his father. But Fusu had also publicly criticized some of Li Si's harshest policies, particularly the book burning and persecution of intellectuals. Li Si made the fateful decision to conspire with the chief eunuch Zhao Gao to suppress Qin Shi Huang's will and install the younger son Hu Hai as emperor instead. His calculation was that Hu Hai would be more manipulable and more willing to continue the policies that Li Si had developed. But this decision proved to be a catastrophic mistake that ultimately led to both his own destruction and the collapse of the Qin Empire. Hu Hai turned out to be weak and incompetent, exactly as Li Si had hoped, but this created a power vacuum that Zhao Gao was eager to fill. Zhao Gao had his own political ambitions and understood that Li Si was the main obstacle to his complete control of the government. Over the next 2 years, Zhao Gao worked systematically to undermine Li Si's position at court and convince Hu Hai that Li Si represented a threat to his authority. Li Si's final downfall came in 208 BCE, when Zhao Gao accused him of treason and conspiracy. The specific charges were probably fabricated, but Li Si had made so many enemies during his years in power that there was little sympathy for him when he was finally vulnerable. He was arrested, tortured to obtain a confession, and finally executed along with all the members of his family. The irony of Li Si's death is absolutely palpable. He had spent decades creating a legal system that made it impossible for anyone to effectively challenge imperial authority. And then he was destroyed by that same system when he lost imperial favor. He had argued that mercy and flexibility in law enforcement were dangerous, and then he discovered that there was no mercy available to him when circumstances changed. The collapse of the Qin Empire shortly after Li Si's death confirms how crucial he had been to the functioning of the system. Without his administrative expertise and strategic planning, the imperial government quickly disintegrated into factionalism and chaos. Rebels were able to exploit weaknesses in the system that Li Si might have identified and addressed. Within 4 years, the entire empire he helped create had completely collapsed. But here's what's fascinating. While the Qin dynasty fell, most of Li Si's institutional innovations survived and were adopted by subsequent dynasties. The Han dynasty that followed kept the commandery and county system, the centralized bureaucracy, the standardized writing, and many other reforms that Li Si had implemented. In fact, these institutions became permanent features of Chinese government and were copied by other East Asian countries. In this sense, Li Si achieved something that few politicians in history have accomplished. He created institutions that survived not only his own death, but the complete collapse of the regime that had originally established them. The fundamental ideas about centralized government, bureaucratic administration, and cultural unification that he developed became basic organizing principles for Chinese civilization for over 2,000 years. Li Si's intellectual legacy is equally impressive and controversial. His ideas about the role of government in society, the importance of institutions over personal virtue, and the need to control information and education have influenced not just Chinese thinkers but political theorists around the world. His synthesis of legalist philosophy and practical administrative considerations created a model of authoritarian government that has been imitated by countless later regimes. But at the same time, Li Si also represents the dangers of concentrated political power and the human costs of ambitious social engineering. His policies caused enormous suffering and suppressed individual freedoms in the name of collective goals. His willingness to use brutal methods to achieve what he saw as beneficial outcomes raises fundamental questions about the relationship between means and ends in politics. What I find most fascinating about Li Si is how his story illuminates tensions that are still central to modern politics. The balance between efficiency and freedom, the tension between unity and diversity, the role of the state in shaping culture and identity. He didn't have the advantages of centuries of experience with democratic institutions or theories of human rights, but he was grappling with many of the same fundamental problems that governments face today. His solutions were often too extreme and authoritarian for contemporary standards, but they also demonstrated what's possible when intelligent, determined leaders focus systematically on problems of government and institutions. Li Si showed that it's possible to create stable, prosperous social order, even under very challenging circumstances. But he also showed that achieving such goals may require methods that violate basic principles of human dignity and individual freedom. Looking back after months of studying Li Si, I'm struck by both his achievements and his failures. He helped create one of the most impressive accomplishments in human political history: the unification of an enormous and diverse civilization under stable, effective institutions. But he did so using methods that caused massive suffering and established precedents for authoritarianism that continued to plague Chinese politics for centuries. His story is a reminder that even the most brilliant and successful leaders operate within specific historical constraints and that their achievements always come with costs that must be honestly acknowledged. Li Si wasn't a monster, but he wasn't a simple hero either. He was a complex human being who made difficult choices under challenging circumstances, and whose legacy continues to shape how we think about government, power, and social responsibility even today.